Okay, I am super excited to share with you this presentation on Gideon. I had no idea this was actually as interesting as it is, but when you really dig deep into the historical events and the people involved and the time period, as well as the land that all of these events took place on, there's just so much history. It's so rich in history and genealogy. So let's get started. All right, the time period is a little bit uncertain, but we think it was around 1191 to 1144 BC. Some think it could be even 1200 years before Christ, but we just know that it's in this time period. So for now, we'll call it 1191 to 1144 BC. We do know that this happened before Jesus came, and it is in the Old Testament. We need to handle a little bit of family business before we dig too deep into this battle that Gideon has with the Midianites. So the first part is to understand more about who is at play. And you've probably heard of Abraham and Sarah. Well, let's back it up just one generation to Abraham's father, Terah. Terah had 3 sons, Haran, Nahor, and Abram. We know that Abram later changed his name to Abraham. Haran, however, had a son named Lot, and you're probably familiar with Lot with Sodom and Gomorrah, where Sodom and Gomorrah was so full of sin and wickedness that God burned the place down, and he told Lot to leave. He was the only one found to be righteous. He left, but God told him, do not turn and look back. And Lot's wife then was with him. She turned and looked back and became a pillar of salt. Now, it's interesting to me just how quickly things can change, where Lot, during the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, was considered one of the only holy or righteous families of the time. After this happened and his wife died, he started having sexual affairs with his 2 daughters. And one of the daughters had a son named Moab, and one of them had a son named Ammon. And that's where we hear about the Moabites and Ammonites. And we'll hear more about the Moabites later in this presentation. Now, the middle part here of Nahor, you're probably familiar with Laban and his 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah, but we're not going to talk about Nahor today. Today, basically, we're talking about Abraham and the Israelites, and then we're talking about Haran and the Moabites. So to dig a little bit deeper with Abraham, it's not as easy as just saying Abraham and the Israelites. So Abraham had 3 wives. Well, not all wives. Abraham had 2 wives, and he had a son with Sarah's maidservant, Hagar. So let's put this in perspective here. Abraham was married to Sarah. Originally, their names were Abram and Sarai. They changed it to Abraham and Sarah. They were desperately wanting a child, and Abraham kept pleading with God that he would do whatever he wanted as long as they would have a child. So in their late years, close to 100, they had their first son, Isaac. However, they were impatient. So before Isaac was born, Abraham and Hagar had a child named Ishmael, and this was all consensual. Sarah actually had Hagar to have this relationship with Abraham so that they could have a child. However, we know that Ishmael and Isaac, there was some strife. So ultimately, Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away. Sarah had Isaac, and then Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, which we're not going to talk about them today. But what we do need to talk about is Abraham's other wife, Keturah. So once Sarah died, then Abraham remarried Keturah, and she had 6 sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Midian is the father of the Midianites. So those are the descendants of Midian, and this is where the problem is coming in. So in this point in time with Judges 6, where we're going to introduce Gideon, the Israelites have turned away from God. They're worshiping false gods, there's sexual immorality, they are sinning big time. And we know that the Israelites were the chosen people of God. But we see this time and time and time again where they'll straighten up and they'll behave and they'll obey God, and then they fall and they start disobeying, and when they do it big. So they actually build an altar to Baal, or they have a golden calf, or they have all these false gods that they worship, and then things happen. And we see time and time again where God is sending them messages, whether it's plagues or whatever, to try and get their attention. And it seems to take a while. So in this case, this strife has been going on for 7 years between the Midianites and the Israelites. So you could almost say it was a family affair. However, this was much, much larger than a family affair at this point in time, because there were so many descendants of Abraham. But it is important to know that the Midianites came from Abraham's wife Keturah and their son Midian. Now let's talk about Gideon. And Gideon was not in either of those family trees. We don't know a lot about Gideon. In fact, we do know that his son, or his father, is Joash, and we know that Gideon was a father of Abidan and Jotham. But that's about it. There's not too much else that we know about Gideon. Now, like, the name Gideon means cutter, or cutter of trees. And you'll see in a picture here in a bit that they lived in a big valley, and it looks like it was a lush land. There was a stream flowing through the middle, so it was probably quite fertile. It was probably a great place to raise crops, to have cattle, and there were probably lots of trees. Now, in the book of Judges, we start to talk about Gideon in Judges 6. That's the first we hear of him. He's the youngest in their family, and their clan is called the Abizrites, which is also known as the weakest clan in Manasseh. The family just seems to be like an ordinary family. And we see that when we're introduced to Gideon in Judges 6, he's threshing wheat in an underground press. So there's this theme with Gideon where he's underground or he's hiding. And I wonder if this might be part of an underground church, let's say. I don't know if Gideon was the only holy person or person trying to worship God, the one and only true God, in this town. It does appear that his father did not. His father was worshiping a false god, but I wonder why he was hiding so much. It says that he was threshing this wheat in an underground press. We also see when God talks to him that he does things at night because he's hiding. He's trying to do this in secret. And I wonder if it's because, similar to what we're doing here in America and around our world, where there's so much sin, so much evil and wickedness, where Christians are trying to be silent. We're trying to be quiet and hidden and not make much noise so that people won't look at us and make fun of us or hurt us or persecute us. And I wonder if that may have been going on in this time period. I couldn't find any research to support that, but I just wonder if that's what's going on, because to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense for an Israelite, for Gideon, to be so private about his faith, other than what we do know for sure is that at this point in time, the Israelites were in a 7-year period of strife with the Midianites. There was just rampant sexual immorality, idolatry, and other sins and evil and wickedness. So it could be, again, I'm speculating, that Gideon was in hiding, like an underground church where he worships God, the one and only true God, privately, but he's not going to speak out. He's not going to put himself out there on his own to really be in harm's way or to be persecuted. I assume that's the case, until we see in Judges 6 when God speaks to him and says, I need you to go and defeat the Midianites. And this really calls Gideon to trust God and to obey God. Because again, Gideon's coming from the weakest tribe in Manasseh, and he is the youngest in his family. So he's questioning, why me? How am I going to do this? And for me personally, I see this because I wonder, why me? How am I going to do this when God's calling me to put a mission together like his kingdom matters, to train and equip Christians to go do things? How am I in a position to do that other than I trust God and I want to obey him and surrender all to him? And that's really where Gideon comes in and shines. So Gideon's legacy now, instead of being the son, the youngest son of a man that's worshiping a false god, instead of being from the weakest tribe, he's known now as the greatest judge of Israel. Now, when God asked him to go and do these things, he did some of them at night. For example, he went to destroy the altar to Baal. Baal was a false god at the time, and Gideon went to destroy that altar and replace it with an altar to God, the one and only true God. He did that at night. And in doing that, Gideon's father renamed him Jerub-Baal, which means let's let Baal contend with him. In other words, Gideon's father wasn't going to punish him. He thought, well, let's let this God punish him for all the wrong that he has done. However, Baal's a false god, so Baal couldn't do anything. He's not a real person. He's not a real God. So nothing happened to Gideon. Next, Gideon cut down the Asherah pole. And the Asherah pole was a pole designed to worship Asherah, who was a fertility goddess. Again, a fake god. So he cuts down that pole and he replaces this area with the altar for the one and only true God, which that altar at this time in the Old Testament would be used to worship God. It would be used to offer sacrifices and those sorts of things. Now we know that Gideon was the fifth judge over Israel. However, when this happened, he probably wasn't thinking, oh, look, there's a job opening to be a judge. I'll go apply for it. No, God appointed him as judge over Israel. And I think that's important for us today to know. Sometimes we don't sign up for these things. Sometimes if we are obedient and if we listen, God will give us a job to do. And our job then is to be faithful and be obedient, just as Gideon was. So Gideon's lasting legacy is that he is a mighty warrior. He conquered the Midianites, he and God together, and we'll see just what the dynamics were of his army. But he is a mighty warrior, a strong leader. He's faithful and obedient. And because of all of this, he is considered the greatest judge of Israel. Now let's take a look at the map to see where is all this happening. For me personally, I like to see the map. I like to know that these are real stories. These are real events that happen. In fact, I don't even like to call them stories because to me, when we say it's a Bible story, a lot of people misconstrue that with a children's story or a make-believe story. These are not make-believe. Real events happened here with real people in real places. This is history. So what had happened, again, is that the Israelites had built this altar to Baal. This town, this valley that I'll show you, was full of idolatry, sexual immorality. It was just full of sin. And I think, again, if we go back to look at the world we live in today, much of what's happening today is sinful. Many people have turned away from God. Many people are worshiping false idols, whether that's a false god, whether it's money, whether it's possessions, whether it's an addiction of some sort. Many people are not keeping their eyes on God. So we see this as well with the sexual immorality. There's so much sexuality in our culture today, and it's wrong. It's just wrong. And it's not that it's old-fashioned, it's that it's just wrong. And we see this playing over and over and over with the Israelites. And I believe it's the same with us today, is that God sends us signs to say, hey, you guys need to straighten up. Yes, we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. We know that from Romans, but we also know that the Israelites are a great example for us of a group, the chosen group, that time and time and time again, they worshiped God, they tried to obey, they did what they should do, and then in a very short time they'd fall short, and they fell big time, where then they were worshiping false gods. They were having all this sin in their life, and then they'd send somebody that would come and try and save them, in this case Gideon, and that may last for a period of time, and then things happen again. So we'll see that in this presentation too. All right, now with this worshiping of the Asherah pole, or the female deity, the sexual fertility goddess, I think it's important to know that going back in time, Israel was ordered by God to conquer Canaan. And when they did that, this we saw in a previous presentation, they didn't actually conquer everybody. They left some survivors. And because they left some survivors, the worshiping of Asherah continued. Now, had they done as they were told, that probably would have stopped. But because they did not obey, then it continues. Now, the Israelites at this point in time were being invaded by the Amalekites, the Midianites, and Eastern foreigners. So even though they had this beautiful valley that they were living in, it was full of crops and cattle and a thriving livestock, thriving really area, fertile land that they could survive. This wasn't a time and place where they could go to the grocery store and get groceries. They had to grow their own crops and their own cattle to live. Now they have these people coming in, the Amalekites, Midianites, and these Eastern foreigners that are taking their crops, that are destroying their crops, taking their cattle and killing their cattle. And this has been happening for 7 years. So you can imagine they're at a point in time where they're just at their wits' end and they don't know what to do. So even though they had not been worshiping God, they knew that in this time period when they're worshiping a false god, all these bad things are happening. So some of them turned to God and said, please help us. And they cried out for help. That's when God then reaches back and pulls Gideon to serve. Now, on the map, let's do a real quick point and check to see where is Midian. Again, I like to know where these places are and what they're called today, just so that we can really put this into context. Because if we ever take a trip to the Holy Land, this would be one of the places that we could actually go to. Now, Midian is located in what we call today Northwest Arabia. You'll see it down here by the Red Sea, and you see the Mediterranean Sea up to the north. Gideon's army, so when God calls Gideon to go and take care of the Midianites, Gideon started to recruit. And he was from a town called Ophrah, which is around Manasseh. He ends up with 32,000 volunteers, which 32,000 volunteers sounds like a lot. However, the Midianites had a much, much larger army. And God actually says, no, that's too many. We don't need 32,000. So you see in the Bible, in the book of Judges, that they are reducing this head count down drastically from 32,000 to 22,000 to 9,700 and eventually to 300. And the way that they did this is that God asked Gideon to take all the soldiers to this place where there's a stream and there's water flowing, and ask them to get drinks. Those that would put the water in their hands, like cup their hands in the water and then lap the water from their hands, those were the soldiers they would keep. The ones that were kneeling down or even laying on the ground to lick it right out of the stream, they got rid of those. They said, nope, we don't need you, go on home. So they kept the 300 soldiers that actually drank the water from their hands. On the flip side, the Midianites had a huge, huge army. So again, the Midianites were descendants of Abraham. And if you remember, Abraham had Ishmael as his first son with Hagar. His second son was Isaac with Sarah. And after Sarah died, he married Keturah, where he had 6 sons, one of them named Midian. So the Midianites were all descendants of Midian. We think that this group of people were nomads, meaning they didn't live in one place. They went from place to place and they traveled together and really didn't have a lot of possessions to carry with them, which would explain why they would come into this area with the Israelites and just take their crops and take their animals, because they didn't have their own place to actually have a garden or have crops and animals to feed these people, all these people, lots and lots of people. So you can see that this would have been a big issue. Now, the Midianites were not always evil. They were actually familiar with God. We see in the Bible that Moses lived with them for a period of time. When he left Egypt, when Moses left Egypt after killing somebody, he fled to Midian and he lived there for a period of time. He actually married the daughter of a Midian priest named Jethro, and like I said, he lived amongst the Midianites. So the Midianites were familiar with God. They probably worshiped God at one time. But this relationship between the Midianites and Israelites became uncivil, especially when they united with the Moabites. So this is where we see the families come together. And these basically are cousins we saw in the family tree, that we have the Midianites who came from Abraham and the Moabites who came from Lot. Now, eventually, God sent Moses back to Midian. So again, he was in Egypt. He left Egypt and fled to Midian. He left Midian at one point in time. And then when Midian became evil, God sent him back, and Moses killed 5 of their kings. We also hear about Midianites in the story with Joseph, when Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers around 1679 BC. So the Midianites have been in several of the historical events in the Bible, several with Moses, and then now this last one with Joseph being sold to the Egyptians, and then now with Gideon. Okay, so we know who's who, and we know where we're at. Now let's figure out who's in which army. So Gideon's army, we know, first and foremost, Gideon has God on his side. He also has 300 soldiers, and they have no weapons. God tells them to take trumpets, clay jars, and inside those clay jars are torches. On the opposite side, we have the Midianites, Amalekites, and people from the east. The Bible tells us they were as thick as locusts, and their camels were as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. So when we put the numbers together, there's about 135,000 soldiers on the opposite side of Gideon, meaning there's 450 Midian soldiers to every 1 Israelite. So let's go back and take a picture just of what this may have looked like. Here we have the Midian soldiers coming into the valley, thousands of them. And Gideon has 300. So Gideon asks God, what am I going to do? And God gives him a strategy. And of that strategy, the idea was that the Midianites would come into the valley, into town, and the Israelite soldiers, the 300, would split into 3 groups, 100 in each group, and they would surround the perimeter of this town. So in doing that, and this was at night again, Gideon did this at night, the Israelite soldiers would blow their trumpets and break their clay jars. So this is a picture of what it may have looked like to carry a clay jar with a torch inside. If they break that clay jar, then the light scatters. And if you can imagine, in the dark of night, the darkness of night that we're not familiar with because we have so much electricity in the world today, but then they did not. So in the darkness of night, when these lights all around the perimeter of this Midianite army, this light shines, and they hear trumpets from all directions. The Midianites got confused and they attacked one another and started to kill each other. And the victory goes to God. So God wins. Gideon and the Israelites win. Gideon becomes a judge for 40 years or thereabouts. And while he was the judge, there was peace. There was a peace that they had not had in such a long time. However, when Gideon died, and he died of old age, he wasn't killed or anything, he just died of old age. Then the Israelites returned to idolatry and returned to sinful lives that were disobedient to God. Now let's talk a little bit about this land. We've seen it on the map, but let's narrow in, let's get laser focused on this land. It's called the Jezreel Valley, and it's a strategic position of a lot of battles in history. I'm going to mention a few, but these battles were some of the big time historical events of history that unfortunately I don't think we're being taught about in school. So I was really excited to read about these and to understand more about this specific place. Now, what's really neat about this is that you can go here. We know exactly where this cave is. This is called Gideon's Cave. We know where this fountain or this spring, it's called Gideon's Spring or Gideon's Fountain. It's also called the Spring of Herod. We know where this location is, and you can go there. It's actually a big park now. You can go and walk and play and sit and meditate and read and anything that you want to do. You can do it right here and know that you're walking the land that Gideon has walked. You're also drinking from the stream or touching the water that Gideon's army touched. So I think that's really, really interesting. Now, Gideon wasn't the only one that we know about that was here. In fact, David and Goliath were here, and Saul and his 3 sons were here. So in the 15th century BC, this was also the site of the Egyptian and Canaanite battle called the Battle of the Megiddo. In 1 Samuel 31, we see that this is the site where Saul and his 3 sons died, causing Israel to go to the Philistines. Now, we know that Goliath was a Philistine. So when David and Goliath came here to fight, that was because of the Philistine control of Israel. Now, like I said, this spring, this specific place that you see in the picture, it's known as the Spring of Goliath. It's also known as the Eye of Goliath or Goliath's Well, and it's the site of Goliath's death. This is also known as the Spring of Herod, Gideon's Spring, or Gideon's Fountain. And this is known as Gideon's Cave. So along with this, I'll show you a picture here in a minute. There's a valley and there's a mountain range. And the mountain range is called Mount Gilboa, which they think has a curse at this point in time because there's been so much tragedy and triumph over the centuries in this one specific place. This shows you the mountain range in the distance and the valley in between Gideon's Cave and the mountain range. Now, this is also the place where Genghis Khan's grandson had a big battle, which was a major turning point in history. So Genghis Khan and the Mongolians wanted to conquer the world. He wanted to own everything. This one battle that took place on this land, the same land where Gideon and his army defeated the Midianites, really squashed that dream of the Mongolians to have world conquest. So the Mamluks of Egypt fought the Mongol Empire right here. And in history, if the Mongolians didn't win, they'd come back and they'd try again. And they'd keep coming back and trying again until they were victorious. But this time that didn't happen. They had one battle, the Mongolians didn't win, and they could not advance any further. And that was it. So this took place around 1260. They say this was the first time the Mongolians were prevented from expanding their empire. And this was also the first battle where a hand cannon was ever used in battle. This one battle actually ended the Mongolian occupation of the Middle East, and it saved Egypt and Europe from the Mongols. Now, a little bit more history that's a little bit more current is Gideon's International. So if you're familiar with the Gideon's Bibles in hotel rooms, then you're probably familiar with Gideon's International, whether you knew it or not. But what happened was two of these men had actually gone to a hotel in Minnesota in the 1800s, and there was only one room. So at that time, they thought, well, let's just share a room. So they had two beds in one room, and they shared that room. That got them to talking about their faith, and they wanted to think about what could we do to spread the good news of Jesus Christ around the world. So they ended up with a third partner, and they decided that they would put Bibles in hotel rooms, and that's how it got started. The saying is that an Old Testament judge, which we know is Gideon, led a small band of soldiers, which we know was 300, to defeat a much larger army. And I think this is a great testimony to Gideon's International. It's also a great testimony to us today that we don't need a big army. Gideon was one person, and he quietly and silently started to do these things. And he was victorious with God on his side because he was obedient and faithful. And we can do the same. Now, Gideon's International, you know they put Bibles in hotel rooms. They also send Bibles to military bases, hospitals, nursing homes, prisons, and college campuses. And it's believed they have distributed more than 2 billion Bibles in more than 95 languages in 200 countries around the globe. Now, one last slide to show you is a recent find in this same location of the Jezreel Valley. In 2021, the Israel Antiquities Authority found this stone. When they had it transcribed, it says, Christ born of Mary. So they think this stone was either part of a church or part of some type of an entrance, like maybe over the threshold of an entrance door around the late 5th century. Now, I think this is interesting just because it goes back to all the history in this place. And I wonder what it looks like today. I've seen some videos where people go and they can sit with the water there at Gideon's Cave and Gideon's Spring, and just how amazing that would be to walk on that land where so much blood has been spilled over the years from all these battles. And really, it's a testimony to God's love for us, that even though people, even his chosen people, disobey him and turn against him, he continues to come back for us. He loves us unconditionally. He wants us to love him too and to follow him. And that we don't have to be somebody, spectacular. We don't have to be a person with a lot of influence. We don't have to be a person that comes from a genealogy that's full of warriors and soldiers. We don't have to be that. We can be an ordinary person just like you and me. We can be an ordinary person that has a love for Jesus, that wants to follow Jesus, that will obey, that will surrender all, and that will do as he asks. And I think that's where we're at today, is what is Jesus calling us to do? How can we make sure that we are doing the right thing? How can we be a light, just like that light in the clay jar? How can we be a light for Gideon's army? How can we be a light for God's army today in this sinful world that we live in?